here's the interesting thing. I never planned on being an author. I don't know how many of you, started a journey thinking that you're going to do one thing, and then life took you on a different road. Has that ever happened to you guys? Yeah? And so, I never planned to be an author. I am an actor and a dancer, and I was a pre-med student in college. And so, writing a book was far away from something I was planning on doing. And certain things in life happened to me that made it really, really clear that I need to write this book, write this story, and share my life with other people. And so, if it's all right with you, I'd like to share a little bit of that story with you guys now. Okay? I grew up in what I call an extremely dysfunctional family. I don't know if anyone here can relate to that. I had a severely mentally ill father. He was borderline paranoid schizophrenic. And in fact, he almost killed me 3 different times in my life. I remember my first memory on this planet. I have in my book, the first part I share my story, but then the second part I talk about some philosophy, some psychology. I give a lot of exercises and tools that you can use to, mentally, emotionally, and physically start to feel better and stronger and change your life. So I really kind of explore all different aspects. And I have this exercise that I actually got from a book called The Grief Recovery Handbook. It's a tiny little book that you can probably read in about an hour and a half if you read it straight. And they have an exercise in there called the Grief History Loss Graph. And what you do is you plot your first memory on this planet. It can, whatever you remember from the very moment you were born. Most people don't remember things when they were babies, but sometimes you remember, the first thing I remember is when I'm 7 or 6 or whatever, right? And then you start to plot the other losses you've had, or you start to plot your losses, and then you see if there's some sort of pattern. And when I did that exercise for the first time, I was pretty amazed because I had a very significant pattern. And when I was 3 years old, the first memory I have on this planet is waking up from a nightmare. And my father went into his crazy mode, pulled me by my hair throughout the house into the living room, which was at the other end of the house. I lived in a pretty big house. And started to beat me. And then he forced me to stay alone in the living room, far away from the rest of my family. And so I started this thought pattern, which was abandonment and pain, that I'm going to get hurt if I cry out. And I realized when I did that graph that every single loss after that first memory had something to do with abandonment. And the next loss that I had was actually when I was 7.5 years old. My mother had her second stroke. Her first stroke was actually when she was 18, and it's miraculous that she was able to survive that. I remember I woke up, I'm 7.5 years old, and I woke up one morning and I saw my father crying in the kitchen, and I was like, "Dad, what's wrong?" And he goes, "Your mother had a stroke, I don't know when she's going to be home." And he was crying, and I didn't really understand what was going on. I was a little child. I didn't know what a stroke was, so I didn't really think much of it. And in my 7.5-year-old mind, I was like, okay, my mom will probably come back when I'm back from school. But what was happening was my body was telling me something else. My body didn't feel right. I remember that thinking, like, what's going on? Why is my throat feeling weird? Why do I feel some pain in my stomach? I didn't really fully understand that, but I did know that things weren't quite right. And it turns out I didn't see my mother for 1.5 years. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with stroke victims. My mother had a very severe stroke. She actually almost died from this stroke. And she had to relearn everything. She had to relearn how to talk. She literally had to relearn how to eat again. She had to relearn how to write, how to walk, how to literally do everything. I didn't speak to her for actually close to 1 year. And I remember I lived with my grandmother during that time. And my grandmother calls me to the phone one night and she goes, your mother's on the phone. And I was so excited. And I run to the phone and I pick it up and I'm like, Ma! And on the other end was this voice that I've never heard before. You see, before the stroke, she actually had a voice similar to mine. At least that's the way I remember it. After the stroke, the only way I can describe it is that it sounded kind of like an effortful croak, kind of like a frog. And I'm not making fun of my mother. It was just this kind of voice that really sounded like almost like a croak. That's really the only way I can describe it. And it actually seemed to go up in volume, but she had a hard time putting words together, and it was really scary for me. I remember listening to this, and I'm looking at my grandmother, and I'm like, who is this? Like, what's going on? It really scared me. And a little while after that, I finally got to see her for the first time. I remember, I'm like hearing a voice. What is that? I remember, back then they didn't prep a child when they went to see something traumatic in a hospital. Nowadays they do that. They've learned, that can be pretty significant for a child to see something or someone that's very ill. But back then they didn't. I remember I went in with my aunt and I walk into the hospital. I remember that smell of the hospital hit me. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about. It was just like, what is that? I'm walking further and further, and then all of a sudden I get to these big, huge doors. And the doors said, ICU. And as soon as I saw those doors, I remember my throat closing up. And I didn't even know what that meant. I didn't know what ICU was. My aunt pushes a door open, and she gently brings me inside, and we go into this room to the right, this little room. And I'll never forget when I looked at my mother, what I saw. This woman, she was kind of like crunched over. She was lying in this hospital bed. She had wires all over her body. And she was completely paralyzed. She only had 6% function left in her right side. She had 0% function in her left. She lost her balance. Like I said, she couldn't talk properly. She couldn't even eat properly. She had lost her balance. And she outstretched her good hand as best as she could. And I remember that sound, that new sound that I was now somewhat familiar with. I heard it say, come to mommy. She tried to smile, and I didn't want to go. And I remember thinking two thoughts. The first one was fear. I didn't know who this woman was. Logically, I knew it was my mother. But emotionally, I was disconnected. Like, who is this woman? And I was scared of this new person I saw in front of me. And then the next thought I had was shame. And I remember thinking, what kind of daughter am I that I can't give my mother a hug? And then I remember my aunt gently pushing me towards my mother. And I gave her a hug. And I automatically felt better. You guys can shake yes or no for this question. I'm just curious to see if you guys can relate to this. I don't know if you've ever experienced that you really wanted to do something, whether it was, talk to someone, write to someone, whatever it was, but for whatever reason you were either scared or angry or sad, and something was stopping you from doing it, but then when you actually went ahead and did it, you actually felt much better. Did any of you ever have that experience? Yeah? And so what I learned was that if we move from a place that comes from here. So I remember that the first meal we had was pizza. And I love pizza. I remember, looking at my mother and watching her trying to eat the slice of pizza. She can't pick it up. And I remember her starting to drool because she lost the ability to control, how to eat properly. And she can't eat the slice of pizza. And I had this huge realization. And I look at her and I'm like, wow, she's not going to be taking care of me anymore. I'm going to be taking care of her. And I go over to her and I pick up the knife and the fork and I, start cutting the pizza and I put it in her hand and I help her learn she had to relearn how to eat. and she's drooling, and then she's laughing because she's drooling, and then of course she has no balance, you know, and so each time she laughs, her head hits the table, and that makes her laugh more. And I'm like mortified. I'm looking at her and I'm like, Ma, like, what are you doing? You know, you're drooling? Like, I'm mortified at this. And I remember looking at me, and she didn't say anything, but she gave me this big smile. And her smile said everything. And she began to teach me something really important. And that changed my life. Now, I didn't get it at 8.5 years old. But this was a continuous teaching that she began to teach me from that first meal. And that was, don't take your life so seriously. You know, I mean, was the stroke devastating? Was it really difficult? Absolutely. She had to relearn everything. It was like she was a baby. She had to relearn how to walk. She had to relearn how to eat. She literally had to relearn how to talk. And she did everything it took. I mean, she was on that walker every day, and of course we needed 2 people in the beginning because she kept laughing so much and we didn't want her to fall, you know. So, I mean, she had such a sense of humor. So she did what it took, but at the same time, she didn't take herself so seriously. She allowed herself to be that baby. I mean, if we think of babies, right, when babies drool, we're not yelling at them. We kind of laugh at them, like, oh, so cute, you know. But it's like somehow we have these ideas of the way things should be, and if they don't stick in our ideas, you know, then we get upset. And it's amazing if you can let go of how we think of the way things should be. If our ideas can broaden, it's okay if an adult drools. Is it the worst thing in the world? Is it maybe a little different than what we're used to? Absolutely. But it's okay. You know, she was still alive, and she did what it took to stay alive and to be happy with her challenges. And that was just something huge, and she had to keep reteaching it to me, because life did seem to get harder as I grew up. Remember, the abuse got worse and worse. So I was the caregiver to my mother. But at the same time, I was dealing with the abuse from my father. And things started to change when I was 14 years old. I remember I came home from school one day, and my father was waiting for me. He attempted to be an Amway distributor, and I use the word attempt because he really was that genius that went over the edge and became insane. I don't know how many of you have seen A Beautiful Mind. I don't know if you're familiar with A Beautiful Mind, yeah? If you haven't, it's a true story of a genius who snapped, who actually has schizophrenia, and it shows that edge of that one moment he's a genius and the next moment he's insane. My father was very, very similar, is very similar to that man. And he looks at me, and I'm walking into the door, and he said, "You're not going to go back to school anymore. You're going to work for me full time." And something overcame me for some reason, because I've never done it before. And I said, "No, I want to go to school." I'm 14 years old. And before he had one of his abusive episodes, it was all in his eyes. And his eyes literally became crazy. It was like, I knew, it was like this, I just knew he was going to come and do something. And one of his ways of abuse was choking, and he ran over to me, and he started to choke me. And just as I was about to black out, he let go, and he started to run out of the house. And that was very normal for him. And I look at him, and something overtook me, and I yelled back at him. I'm like, "Why don't you just finish the job?" That, of course, made him crazier, and he ran back to me, and he choked me harder. My mother started to scream, and he took the wheelchair, and he kicked it really hard, and she went flying through the house, and her wheelchair hit the back kitchen door. And she started screaming more. She didn't fall out of the wheelchair, but she got traumatized by the experience. And that made him stop, and he ran out. And I'm shaking, you know, and I'm crying. And I look at my mother, you know, and throughout those years, I was actually angry at her. because I kept telling her, like, why don't you leave him? I mean, she was handicapped, severely handicapped, but we had a very large family who was very capable of taking care of us. You remember, I lived at my grandparents for many, many years, and they only lived 5 houses down. I was like, why don't we just move in with them? Like, why do we have to go through this? And I didn't understand back then that when you're going through abuse, my mother kept saying, but he needs me. And I didn't understand that. Later on, I understood that sometimes when we're going through abuse and we're the victims of abuse, we feel that we're causing it. And I didn't really understand that at that time, and so I was really angry at her. I remember looking at her and I was like, I can't take this anymore. This needs to stop. And my mother looked at me and she said, yeah, we need to stop it. She was completely supporting me. And I decided to do something I've never done before, and that was reach out for help. I remember I lived in a duplex. We lived on the bottom, and I had a neighbor who lived on the top. And I ran out of my door, and I started running up the stairs to my neighbor. And as I was running up, my neighbor was already meeting me halfway down. And I learned something huge, and that was when we actually reach out to help, for help, many, many times the help is already there. Sometimes we don't see it right away because we're going through a lot of trauma, we're going through a lot of pain, and sometimes it's just really hard to see. But if we stay open to the help, then we can see it, and we will see it eventually. And so I look at my neighbor, and my neighbor at times tried to help me, but it's hard, especially back then. It was uncomfortable to step in because people just didn't know what to do, and I say nowadays they still don't know what to do when they're on the outside. And he looks at me and he goes, I think we need to call the cops. Now, I also grew up in this ultra-religious Jewish household. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that lifestyle. You're not. Very, very strict rules. Like from the way you dress, from what you eat, how you eat it, a lot of praying, a lot of very, very specific rules from the moment you wake up until you go to sleep. And one of the rules is honor your father and mother. And in my mind, I knew that calling the cops on my father would not be honoring my father. And so I was thinking, oh my God, am I going to be breaking a major rule here? And my neighbor happened to be Jewish. He wasn't religious. He goes, you're going to be fine. Your father did what he did. I think it's not breaking this rule. You're going to be okay. You need to start thinking about protecting yourself. And so I said, okay. We called the cops, and the cops came, and the cops explained that I'm going to have to press charges, but it's good to do that so that this way we can get the abuse to stop. And I was like, okay. And they arrested my father, and then the next phone call I made was a rabbi in the community who also happened to be a therapist, a psychologist. He was my best friend's father, and I remember calling him. We used to nickname him Pink Sunglasses because he was one of these people that, like, there could be a tornado outside, fire everywhere, destruction going on, and everything was fine. No worries. You guys know somebody like that? So he looked through the world through pink sunglasses. And I called him up and I told him what happened. And he was like, don't worry, we pressed the charges, everything's going to be okay. And since he was a rabbi, he was like, don't worry, the honor your father is, you're not breaking any rule here, you're going to be fine. You know, your father needs to go through this. And so I was like relieved. Okay, I got the license, I can do this now. And he actually took me to court, and he sat with me in the room while the prosecutors explained what was going to happen. And I was all ready to go. And I remember I walked out of that little room where the prosecutors were. I was about to open up the courtroom door. And just then, my principal walks by me. Now, I went to a very religious school, and my principal came for one reason. And he looked at me, and he said, if you don't drop the charges, don't come back to school. And I was like shocked. And I look at, Mr. Pink Sunglasses, and he goes, no worries, we dropped the charges, everything is going to be okay, I'll talk to your father. And I was just like, so I had those same conflicting feelings. I'm looking at him, and I'm like, fear. I'm scared of my father. What is he going to do to me? Because now I'm not going to drop the charges so he can now come home and hurt me. I'm ashamed because the prosecutor spent an hour and a half with me, coaching me, telling me what's going to happen, and now I'm not going to do what they told me to do. And so I was ashamed and scared of them. And then I felt abandoned again because I felt like I couldn't count on any of the adults in my life. And I remember going into the court and sitting down, and then I saw completely changed my life. On this side of the courtroom was this row of men, and they had these huge shackles on them, like on their wrists and on their ankles. I mean, I was expecting handcuffs, but I don't know if you guys, I'm a theater person, so I don't know if you know Les Mis, or if you think of like the Revolutionary War, you know, the French Revolution, when all of the criminals had these huge shackles on them. And they all had these shackles on them. And now most of the men were like what you would consider, you know, typical criminals. Like Hollywood would cast all of them as criminals, right? Scary looking men, you know, bunch of tattoos, kind of big, rough looking. And then there was my father. My father is 6 feet tall, you know, very lanky kind of guy. He was visibly shaking. And I remember his head was down and he's trying to pray. And I completely was shocked by how my mind shifted. For the first time, I never had this thought until that moment. And that was that my father's not a bad person. He's a really, really sick person. He needs probably medication, probably a few different medications. You know, maybe a doctor or two, maybe even a hospital for a while. Probably a lot of love and comfort. But prison isn't going to help him. It's not going to solve this problem that we both have. And I couldn't believe how my mind completely shifted for the first time. And I also realized that my principal, who at first I actually was a little upset at, like how could he do this to me, turned out to be my angel. Because if he wouldn't have said what he said, I probably wouldn't have thought what I had thought. I probably would have just been focusing, okay, I need to press charges. I need to press charges on my father. I might have not noticed what I noticed. And so my principal gave me an opportunity to change how I was thinking. And I started to learn something really profound. And again, I didn't learn it quite completely then, but it was the beginning. It was like the bud in a flower. And I started to realize how powerful the way we think actually is. And I realized that the way we think will produce certain feelings, right? And then those feelings are going to create certain actions that we take, maybe sometimes some inactions. In other words, if we feel a certain way, we might want to do something or stay away from doing something. And because of that, that will always produce certain results that are in front of us. So it's always the actions or the inactions that we take, but where do they come from? They always come from certain feelings. Where do the feelings come from? Well, they always come from a certain thought. And now where do our thoughts come from? Well, most of our thoughts actually come from what I call a sponsoring thought, or many of the teachers call a sponsoring thought. And if we can figure out, well, what is that sponsoring thought? And for me, it was fear, you know, fear of abandonment. It was me feeling like a victim most of my life, and that people around me are going to hurt me. People around me are going to reject me, and are going to constantly make me feel invisible. Well, I continued to create more opportunities. Like, I couldn't believe what a powerful creator I was when I started to look back at all of the things I created in life that were around abandonment and feeling invisible and feeling alone. And so this little episode, I realized that my principal was an angel, but at the same time, I could have looked at him like him abandoning me again. But I started to flip it. And I was like, thank you for being my angel. And so I started to heal. It wasn't quite the end, but it was the very, very beginning for me. And it started to change my life. And I started to get a little bit stronger. And now the abuse continued to happen, but it wasn't quite as bad. because I started to realize that my father was sick and that I also didn't want to take so much abuse from him. So I either found myself away from him, and so when he was home I wasn't, or when I was home he wasn't, or when he was around I just simply stepped a little bit more in my power so that the abuse wasn't as severe. And so the choking actually stopped. He still continued to emotionally abuse me and do some other stuff, but I was starting to change. And I realized, wow, if we start to change, then perhaps the people around us start to change. And again, it wasn't something I fully understood, but I started to grasp a little bit of that, and I was just so amazed. Now, growing up in a religious household, one of the things that happens is, as a young girl, the parents arrange a marriage for you. And so they set you up with a boy, and the parents of a boy do the same thing for a girl. Now, most families, they give you choices, and so, if you don't like the first boy, okay, then they'll set you up with another boy. Okay, maybe you like this one better. And it kind of goes on until the boy and the girl are like, okay, I think we can kind of learn to like each other, and then they get married. And that's kind of how it works, Now, living with my mother, although I loved her, I was a little bit, I felt ambivalent to the fact that I was her caregiver and I didn't have my own life. And at the same time, I also wanted to escape what was going on with my father and me. And so the first boy that was arranged by my aunt and my future husband's parents, I took. I was like, he's not going to kill me. None of that energy I felt. So I was like, okay, it's safe. Let's go. It's a marriage. And I got married. I got married at 18 years old. And I had 4 children really, really quickly. And it turns out that my husband was emotionally abusive. And it was amazing. Again, I don't know how many of you have ever had this experience. I don't know, you have a friend come over, and she's sharing all of her problems with you, and it's so clear what the solution is. It's like, yeah, why don't you just do this? And you're giving her advice, you're being compassionate to her, and you're helping her through it. And she's like, thank you so, so much. And then she goes to the next person, and the next person, and says kind of the same thing, and maybe hears it a little bit differently. And then she goes back to you, and she goes, Vicki, you'll never believe what Mary told me. And you're like, oh my God, I told you that like 3 weeks ago. I don't know, have you ever had that experience happen to you? Yeah. And then, what about the other way? Have you ever been on the other side, where you're telling one person your problems, and then you tell the next person, and you hear the advice, and it somehow seems kind of familiar, but maybe not quite the same, right? You hear it again and again and again and again, and then like number 10, you're like, oh my God, I never thought of it that way, and you're just somehow it clicks, and then you somehow take the advice. Have you ever experienced anything like that before? Yeah? And so what I've learned was we all have that experience, both ends. And there's a few different reasons why that happens. And the first one is sometimes we're just not ready to make a change. I don't know if you've ever heard the expression, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Yeah? And so sometimes we just want to or need to express ourselves, experience the experience a little bit more, And another reason is that sometimes we need to hear it in a very specific way. It's kind of like, I'm a motivational speaker, right? And there's like a million of us. But some people really click with one person. Like I remember I listened to Marianne Williamson, who's a motivational speaker, an inspirational teacher. And then that same day I actually heard Wayne Dyer, another inspirational teacher. And for some reason I clicked with Wayne Dyer. I was like, oh my God. They were kind of saying the same thing. But sometimes we click with hearing it in a very specific way. And then the third reason is sometimes it's kind of like learning math, like when we're in kindergarten and we learn 2 plus 2. We don't get it right away. We have to practice it a few times, right? And the same thing with reading, and the same thing with writing. It takes some practice. When we're dealing with life, it's the same thing. Sometimes we have to practice it and hear it a bunch of ways and a bunch of times before it actually integrates into our system and we're actually able to do something with our life. And the same thing was true with me and with the abuse and with really being ready to make a change. And so for all of those reasons, I went from a physically abusive, father to an emotionally abusive husband. And it took me many, many years for it to click and be ready. Because I had all of those people telling me what I need to hear and do in order to really feel better and create a different story, create a different life. But for all of those reasons, I needed to experience or wanted to experience it longer. I didn't hear it in the way I needed to hear it, or I needed to hear it a certain amount of more times for me to actually integrate it and get it to shift. And I was ready, and it all came together 12 years into my marriage, 4 children later. I used to barter with a college girl. She came once a week to clean my house, and in exchange, I gave her like a fitness class, yoga, or sometimes, Pilates. I was more into the fitness aspect of things back then. And most of the time, my husband let her in. He was home from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and he let her in and, hung out with her, spoke with her most of the time. And I was either usually teaching or taking a class. I was in college myself at that time, and I wasn't home with her. This one particular day, I came home early for some reason, and just as I got home, my husband left and did some errands. And so I had some time to just chit-chat with another girl. I liked to talk back then too, and so I talked a lot, and I was just kind of being, chilling and just having a nice time. And I remember she stopped cleaning and she just looked at me. And that same thing that happened in the ICU happened at that moment. My throat closed. I remember my whole body actually got cold. And I started to freak out. I was like, oh my God, what is she going to tell me? And she looked at me and she's like, how the hell do you let him talk to you like that? And I was like, and I remember I'm like racking my brain. I'm thinking of what maybe 5 minutes, not even, of interaction she saw between me and my husband, right? And I'm like, what did he do? What did he say? And I was like, oh my God, like he was on his best behavior. I don't know, did you ever have like a thought like, oh my God, I can't believe I just thought that? Well, that thought was that to me. I was like, I can't believe I just thought that. Like, how clueless am I that I can see how easily I give my power away when it's so obvious to everybody else. And all of those people that said pretty much the same thing to me for 12 years, all of a sudden came back. I was like, wow, I have heard this before. For some reason at that moment, I was ready to make a change. I still don't fully understand why, but I started to make a change, and I looked at her, and I'm an actor and a dancer, right? And I also was in victim mode then. My energy was all about people hurt me. And she was about to enter the military 2 weeks later, so she's like a tough girl, And I remember I looked at her, and I was like, well, I don't know, what do you think I should do? And she was like, I don't know, like put him in his place or get rid of him. Like, it was so obvious. It was so simple. It's kind of like when your friend comes up to you and you know what to do. It's so simple for you, but it's really complicated for her. And the same is true when we ask advice for our own problems. Sometimes it's just so hard to see it because we're in it, but it's so simple for the person that's outside of us. And we always have these angels that are there just saying it like it is, and it's really, really simple. And then when we're ready, it actually becomes simple for us. We're like, oh, that's it? And so, as soon as she said that, and it was that simplicity that really got to me, I made a decision, and that decision is what changed my life. And I made a decision, I will never give my power away again. And I also wanted to spend the rest of my life inspiring other people as best as I can. And that's why I started to write the book. And that's where the book came from. And that's why I'm doing this shelter tour. So that maybe some aspect of my story I can relate, you guys can relate to. And it can, at the very least, give you hope. Now here's the amazing thing that I've learned. When I actually filed for divorce 2 weeks after that conversation, about 2-3 weeks after, I delved into self-development. I mean, I studied from everybody and everything, whatever I could get my hands on. I started to study, you know. I started going to seminars, I got coaches, and I realized something pretty profound. Are you all right? Yeah.
I have an allergy.
Yeah. I bet this change of weather. I realized something amazing. That when you actually jump, in my case, I jumped out of my comfort zone. I didn't take a small step. It was huge. I had 4 kids, no money coming in. I'm like, holy crap. Like, oh my God. I was really scared, you know? And I realized that things actually get worse when you really jump out of your comfort zone before it gets better. But it's actually okay. And I bring the analogy of when I broke my ankle. I told you I was going to share a broken bone story. I was a figure skater as well. And I remember I was skating on the ice. Now, when I was about to do something really difficult, and I concentrated on it, you know, I did those jumps and those spins, perfect, no problems. You know, never hurt myself. But then when I wasn't really concentrating, and I had all these thoughts flooding my mind, and I'm talking, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, that's usually when I either hurt myself, sprained my ankle, and in this case I broke my ankle, and it's so similar to life. When things are really, really crazy, and really, really rough, you know, we concentrate on that, you know, when there's a tornado, the only thing you're thinking about is holding on and like not letting anything, you know, surviving, right? But when things are kind of, when we're skating on ice, you know, we can fall and slip and hurt ourselves. And I remember I fell down, I'm talking to somebody on the ice and we're not concentrating, I fall down, and a fluke accident, I broke my ankle. And I had like 6 Olympic coaches around me. It was kind of funny. And they're all deciding if I actually broke it or not. She's not screaming loud enough. Like, you know, maybe she did, maybe she didn't. You know, they're all discussing. They're having a discussion over coffee, you know, around me screaming. I couldn't. And then there's this beginner skater, probably his first time on the ice, right? And he's like skating towards me. And it's like a big football player kind of guy, you know, huge guy. He picks me up, no problem for him to pick me up. And he's like, I got her, and he's like slowly skating off the ice, and then he falls down, and I fall down right on top of him. And so my joke is, it's like, we don't know when I actually broke my ankle. Was it first or second fall, you know? It was pretty crazy. And so I go to the hospital, and I need surgery, and Ernie, you know, Sesame Street Ernie, he greets me. He's like my favorite character, right? Now, he didn't have his costume on because, you know, he was one of the orderlies. His name happened to be Ernie, but he just reminded me of Ernie. He was just like, oh, sparky and fun, and he looks at me and he goes, it's gonna be okay. Do you know that I broke both my ankles two years ago, and I was in a wheelchair for 6 months? And then he's like, starts jumping, and he's like, it's okay. You're gonna be fine. Look, I'm walking, and I'm gonna show you how to use the crutches. And I realized, wow, and sometimes in our most painful states, there are angels that show up. And he was my angel. Because I remember thinking, like, am I gonna be able to, you know, dance again? Oh my God, I don't even know if I'm gonna skate again. But Ernie showed up to let me know it's gonna be okay. And sometimes when things are really, really crazy and really, really hard and we're really, really scared, sometimes we can see the angels, but sometimes we can't because, again, we're so wrapped up in our mind. But if we can remember, you know, in those really, really tough times, just to like open up your eyes a little bit because there are angels around us and realize that it's just that moment. My ankle didn't stay broken the whole time. And, you know, it was funny because as I was healing, I needed surgery, and as I was healing, I couldn't believe my nerves are coming together, everything is fine. The pain got so much worse. I mean, the painkillers were doing nothing. I'm not even like religious, and I was falling to the ground praying, like, please take this pain away from me. And I had this huge realization that if physical pain, when you're healing from something physical, and it gets worse, probably the same is true when you're healing from a life circumstance, maybe from an emotional trauma, that sometimes it feels worse, but it doesn't mean it's bad. My nerves were coming together. When we're healing from a broken heart, you know, sometimes it hurts as it's healing, but it's okay. We're on the right track. And it was a pretty amazing thing for me to learn. And so as things got worse and I screamed myself to sleep every night, I still knew that I was on the right track. And so things got worse before they got better, but I started to realize that I'm actually on the right track. As his abuse got better, like, see, during the marriage he wasn't physically abusive, but during the divorce process he actually became a bit physically abusive in front of the children too. And so things got a lot worse, but it actually made it clearer that I'm on the right track. And, you know, and that's why I'm doing this work that I'm doing. And I just started to heal myself and become stronger and really learn to step into my power. And it was a process. It did not happen overnight, and I'm still working on it. You know, and I feel like life is about that. You know, it's a constant journey. In yoga, we call it a yoga practice, you know, because we're constantly practicing ourselves. You know, meditation is also a meditation practice. And life is like that. We're not meant to be perfect. You know, one of the shelters I was at, you know, one of the men was sharing with me. I went to a shelter with men and women, and some of the men did a podcast with me. And he goes, you know, I've done a lot of bad things in my life, and I feel like I've become a really bad person. And I looked at him and I said, no, you're not a bad person. Do we do sometimes things that don't feel good to ourselves and to other people? Absolutely, because a lot of times if we move from a place of fear, it won't feel good. It doesn't make us bad people. It makes what we do maybe not feel so good. And I told him that, I said, you're a wonderful person. And now that you realize that, ooh, maybe I can now do actions that actually feel good, you know, to myself and to other people, you know, so then I'll always be doing things that feel good. And it doesn't make a person good or bad. My father was not a bad person. He was somebody that needed some help because he didn't know how to feel good properly. I feel like, you know, in a part of my book, I talk about basic needs that we all have. And one of the basic needs we all have is love and belonging. You know, another basic need is power. I mean, we think of the word power as a bad thing, but, you know, power can be a teacher. Power can be an actor, you know, empowering people. You know, power can be a crossing guard or a policeman, you know. And then some people who have a power need and they don't know how to get it the right way, you know, they might do a criminal act or they might become abusive. You know, but more often than not, when people do something that don't feel good, it really is coming from a need for love and belonging, and they just don't know how to get it. And if we can understand that, we don't necessarily have to be angry at that person. And sometimes things hurt. You know, sometimes we go through things and they really, really hurt. And it's okay. Sad is not bad. These feelings that we have, they go through us. They're not part of us. And if we can just allow these feelings to just be feelings and move through us, then we can move past that. You know, one of the exercises that I did in my healing was this act of forgiveness. You know, and sometimes we have to forgive ourselves before we can actually forgive other people. You know, if we allowed other people to talk to us the way we talk to us, we probably wouldn't be alive. You know what I mean? We are our worst critic. And when we can learn this act of forgiveness, one of the first things I learned is that it actually is about releasing for us. If we can forgive somebody, then we're letting go of that story that we actually keep reliving by not forgiving. And I remember one of the exercises I did is I wrote a letter to my father. I was typing it on my computer, and I never sent it to him. I remember I'm typing all of the stuff he did, all of those actions that hurt, all of this pain that he caused me, and I just wrote it. And then I started to write why I'm forgiving him and actually why I love him. And I got to a point where my hands were just typing, and it was effortless. It almost like it was coming through me, like I wasn't doing it. And I finished this letter, and I'm just sitting in my chair, and tears were just coming out of my eyes. And I'm sitting there for about an hour and a half, literally just crying. But it was tears of joy. And I had this physical sensation, I'll never forget it. It was like this physical, huge, heavy rock that I was holding, literally lifted off of me. I couldn't believe that I actually was holding on to that for so many years. And I started to discover the power of forgiveness. that forgiveness is not about condoning the actions that cause the pain. Do we experience pain? Absolutely. And we're not condoning these actions. But we're releasing the story and the experience so that we can move on and that we can heal. And that was a really, really powerful thing for me to experience. And so, by me healing, again, I started to realize, I'll just repeat it, that our thoughts is what really creates these feelings that we have. And those feelings is where our story comes from. If we can start changing or releasing the story, then we're going to start taking different actions, or maybe taking different inactions. We're going to stop doing certain things. And then our results will therefore be very different. And so if we're not liking what we're experiencing right now, at this moment, that is such a cool thing. You know, and we didn't create what we're experiencing right now. I mean, if we look at my book, right? You know, my book took 12 years to write. 12 years. I started writing it when my mother was in the hospital before she died. It took me 12 years. It didn't happen overnight, right? I mean, this lamp didn't show up by a thought. Someone thought about this lamp, and then they had to create the picture. Then they needed to get the materials, right? And they made that first one. Then they had to bring it to a factory and, you know, raise the money perhaps to bring it to the factory and create a whole bunch. Then they had to find a way to market it to the stores. And they needed to get salespeople to bring it to the stores, right? And then they brought it to the stores, and the stores bought it. And then Swamini went and purchased it and brought it into her house. And then all of a sudden we have a lamp. And so it took a long time to get the lamp here. It didn't just happen with the thought. And that's a really beautiful thing. And so we look at our life and we're like, we're not happy with the way our life looks. Awesome. And so what thoughts are we thinking that we can perhaps change that will create maybe different feelings so we can produce different actions? And so we'll have a different result. So the next thing that I learned was huge. In my growing process, my self-growing process, I ended up with a really amazing coach. I don't know how many of you know the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Do you know that book? Okay, y'all know that book. Wow, most of you. Oh, well, that's awesome. And so y'all know the story. I actually studied from Rich Dad. His name is Keith Cunningham. One of the most profound men that I've ever had the fortune of learning from. And I remember he said that everything that you are experiencing in your life is a result of what's non-negotiable to you. I had to sit with that for a second. I'm like, non-negotiable? What the hell are you talking about? And he's like, okay, you look at someone like Donald Trump, right? How does Donald Trump go into bankruptcy over and over and over again and end up with more than what he started with before? And he said it's because being a millionaire for Donald Trump is non-negotiable. That to him is broke. Like, he can't be a millionaire because he's literally broke then. He needs to be a billionaire. And so, for some reason, when he goes into this bankruptcy mode, it pushes him to make more. It's kind of this weird thing. And Keith Cunningham himself was actually worth $400 million at one point and lost it all. He actually was broke for about 8 years until something clicked. And he's like, it's not negotiable for me to be broke. And so he did whatever it took, and he literally got 400 plus in about 9 months. I still don't understand it. I'd love to know his secret, because I keep saying it's non-negotiable for me too, but I don't have that trick yet. But I do understand it. But this is something that you and I can understand. You know, for some of us, it's non-negotiable to, you know, not work out. Like, I do something physical every day. It's non-negotiable for me not to. You know, for other of us, it's non-negotiable to drink. Or maybe to not drink. For some people, it's not. I need to have a drink in my hand. You know, for others of us, it's non-negotiable to not brush our hair every day. In other words, we all live our life in a very specific way based on what's negotiable or not negotiable to you. And so when he taught me that, I had to like sit and really think about, well, what's negotiable in my life that maybe I don't like that I can maybe switch and make non-negotiable. And I started to think about that. And I started to realize that we literally can change everything. And it really does go back to our thoughts and the rules that we've set. I mean, if you think of a relationship, right? Why do we get mad in a relationship? Because we have certain things that are either negotiable or non-negotiable to us, certain set of rules. And so when the socks end up on the floor and we start yelling at our partner for keeping the socks on the floor, it's because it's our rule. It's non-negotiable to us. Not to him. He never said yes or no to that, right? We said yes and no to that. And so we get all worked up. And so if we can realize, what's our non-negotiable mindset versus his, or vice versa, right? And then we can either let go of certain things and realize it's our own thoughts, or we can discuss it with people and see if we can actually compromise. And that's specifically with relationships, but the truth is it's with everything in our life. If we realize what really gets us upset at every moment and every day, we're always getting upset about these thoughts that we have that's non-negotiable. And so we can make a decision, well, if it truly is non-negotiable, then what can we do about it? Can we actually take steps to do about it? Remember, Eckhart Tolle always says, if you don't like your present moment, either change it or find a way to actually accept it. It's really one or the other. And so, not that it's easy to do. Everything I'm saying, I understand it's not necessarily easy stuff. But if we can even take a moment to find a way to either accept something, find the negotiation in it, or change it if we don't like it, or move away from it if we don't like it. Sometimes we don't have to move away. Sometimes we just have to flip something, right? Move the furniture around if we don't like the way it's set up, And then we can start to be a lot, easier on ourselves and nicer to ourselves and really not beat ourselves up. And so, I think if we stick with that, and I know I gave you guys a lot, but see if you can take even just one aspect. I say, the first thing that I would start with is, what can I let go of? What can I forgive myself with? What can I hold myself and give myself a hug with? I'm holding this Play-Doh in my hand because I always like to remember that we need to cherish that child inside of us. Sometimes we don't have that childhood. I didn't have a normal childhood, right? I grew up really quickly. And so I like to find that child in me. I'll very often jump up and down and start giggling. And, I do yoga as a child. In fact, I work with children all the time. So I think it's very healing. It doesn't matter if we're 5 or if we're 50. It's okay to be a child every once in a while. It's really, really healing, And then we can also forgive ourselves and just hold that child in us and comfort that child and say it's okay. And if we can do that to ourselves, then we're going to find the other people around us to do it for us too. And so find what needs are not being met and how can we just give it to ourselves and really start to love ourselves. And that love will, surround us when we start to learn to just give it to ourselves. I just want to thank you guys. You guys were awesome. Thank you for letting me share. I hope you guys like the book. Y'all like reading? Yeah? Okay, you gotta keep me up to date. Let me know how you like it. You can write to me, and, just share with me. Share with me what your experiences are. You know what my next project is? This is actually pretty exciting. I keep forgetting to tell it to people, when I'm going around. But my next project is actually, I told you about the Voices of Women podcast where, if you guys ever want to share just your voice and your story, you can. But I'm also collecting stories in my travels because, my story is just my story. It's just one story that maybe everyone can relate to some aspect of it. But we all have a story in us. And some of us maybe want to share that story. And so my next book is a collection of stories from a bunch of women who just want to share something that they've went through and maybe perhaps came out the other side. And so the next book is called Voices of Women. And if you guys want to be part of it, just give me your email address. And when I'm ready to start collecting those stories, I'll email you and let you know. So I'm really excited about that. Because I could talk about me forever, but now I need you guys to share. So now that's a wrap.